Thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you very much. Before I begin my formal remarks, there's one comment that I would like to make to each and every one of you. While my crew and I may have saved that ship, we also know that we could not have done it without the support, and the prayers of Americans back here at home who were able to sustain us through some pretty dark hours when we were working to keep the ship afloat and save our shipmates. So on behalf of my crew, I want to take time, especially this Memorial Day, to thank each and every one of you as Americans for what you do for us. I was very fortunate on USS Cole to stand on the fantail, which is the very back end of the ship, the flight deck area where we land and take off helicopters, and say the three greatest words that a naval officer can say in their career: I relieve you. And it's with those three simple words that I carried out a centuries-old, time-honored tradition where I assumed total accountability and responsibility for a $1 billion national asset and the lives of almost 300 of our nation's finest sailors. I knew that as I took command, I was going to have to find a way to convey to my crew what I expected of them, what my standards of performance were, and what I wanted them to hopefully achieve during that one-year period that we had to get ready for deployment to the Middle East and the Mediterranean. So I sat down and created what I call my command philosophy, which listed my goals and expectations for the ship. And I'll run through these very quickly, but it's important for you to understand the mindset that I went into. The first and foremost thing that I looked at in what I call my 5 pillars of leadership is something that each and every one of you have to do in your businesses to be a success. And that is, you underline everything with one word: integrity. If you don't have the integrity to do what's right when things are going easy and in good times, when the pressure's on, when the heat's there, and people are demanding things of you, you're not going to make the right decision. So that's what I had to tell the crew, is each and every one of you have to be able to do it right. The next thing I needed to convey to them is the vision. Here's where we are now. There are a number of things we need to do to get ready to go out to the tip of the spear and defend freedom. How are we going to get this ship there? So I had to tell them, here's my vision for where we want to go. I knew where I needed to get there. As with most people, they don't like change, and what you have to do is convince them that change can actually be a good thing, but here's how we're going to do it to make it as painless as possible and also make it better for you. Developing a sense in them of personal accountability and responsibility. A lot of people look at the young people today and say they have no concept of this. They don't know what it means to be responsible for their own actions. That's not true. As leaders, it's up to us to develop it in them, teach them how to do it, so that they can learn to expect it, not just within themselves, but from each other. And that's how you create a team. That's how you create a crew that's going to be able to go out there and rely on each other when the times get really difficult. The next thing I tried to do with them is what I call trusting and investing. I'm one of those people that don't like the word empower. Empower means that you're just going to have something, do something you didn't want to do to begin with, so you're going to empower them to get it done. Trusting investing takes it to the next level, which means you're going to give them what they need to do their job best. You're going to make sure that you are giving them the opportunity not only to succeed, but to potentially fail as well. We all know that some of life's greatest lessons come from not just failing, but in figuring out how to pick yourself up by your bootstraps and moving forward. And we would go through a number of failures during the year, as any ship does. But guess what? We picked ourselves up and moved forward. The last thing I would like to look at, right there at the bottom. When it comes right down to it, we can, we will, and we must be able to do what's necessary to protect our ship and keep it moving forward. By having the idea of what you want to do with your people, sailors, like everyone you work for, ask for 5 simple things. They want to be told what their job is. They want to be told what the standard is you expect them to do it to. And then they look at you to make sure you give them the training, the tools, and the time to do it right. I've always found that when people do something wrong, if you walk the dog backwards, you will generally find that somewhere along the line in their chain of command, it wasn't that young sailor that did something wrong. It was actually someone up the chain failed to give them one of those 5 key tools to make sure they were a success of it. So after I lay all that out, we have 1 year to get ready for deployment, and we start doing some of the really good and fun stuff at this point. We're shooting guns, we're shooting missiles, we're practicing what we call damage control drills, which means we're landing helicopters on board the ship and doing fun stuff like that, but also we're putting people in these firefighting ensembles to prepare for if the worst happens. What if we get hit by a torpedo? What if we get hit by a missile? What if we get hit by a bomb? How are we going to react? You can see in the next one right there, we actually will smoke out the spaces so that when they put all this gear on, you can literally stand with your hand in front of your face and it's like being in a pitch dark room. Because when you're on a ship at sea, there's no 911 that you call to come help you out. You are the team. You have no one you can rely on, so you have to make sure that people are ready to go and be able to do what they need to do. During that 1 year period, we were part of the George Washington Aircraft Carrier Battle Group, and in the summer of 2000, we were ready. In August of 2000, we deployed the ship, and we achieved something the morning we left Norfolk, Virginia, our home port, that had never been done in the Navy before and has never been repeated since. When USS Cole got underway, that ship pulled away from the pier and all of my officers were out manning the rail, standing there looking good for the families as we left port. I got that ship underway with a 100% all-enlisted watch crew manning every single station. That's the kind of confidence that I had in my crew. That's the kind of talent that I knew was available that I had tapped into and was able to pull off. So what did we do? We left on deployment, we ran across the Atlantic Ocean. When we got to the other side, we pulled into the Mediterranean, and unfortunately the first thing we did was suffer for 4 weeks. We had to suffer through Barcelona, Spain, Villafranche, France, Valletta, Malta, Koper, Slovenia. What was our job? It was to do port visits and show the American flag. But we also knew what was to come. We did some operations off of the Adriatic with our old friend Milosevic, who was stirring things up, and we'd had the bombing campaign in Kosovo. We did that for about 2.5 weeks, but in early October, on October 6th, it came time for us to finally do what we were supposed to do. We went alongside of an oiler, about 140 to 160 feet apart, with high-tension cables. We topped off all of our food, all of our stores and spare parts. We would actually take on fuel. You can see the fueling probe right there going in. Topped at us about 96% fuel. And what did we do? We raced across the eastern Mediterranean starting on the 6th of October, through the Suez Canal on the 9th of October. We would go down the Red Sea, and we would round the corner after going by the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb. In the morning of 11th of October, midnight of the 11th of October, we were off the port of Aden, Yemen. Now, a lot of people wonder, why Aden, Yemen? If you look at where that port sits, which is at the far southwest corner of the Arabian Peninsula, it sits astride some of the most strategic sea lanes in the world. The amount of goods and oil that go by there, up through the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal, back to the underbelly of Europe, that explains why we would want to operate there. Oh, by the way, that's also a major port that we hopefully could have operated out of that would have been handy today, especially with the piracy that's going on off the Horn of Africa. Unfortunately, that wasn't to be. Instead, early morning on the 12th of October, we go into the port of Aden, Yemen. You can see that on the eastern side of the picture, or the right-hand side. We go up a shipping channel. We go in, and we know we're going to be a pier out in the middle of the harbor. When we get up in there, I turn the ship around, and there we are, 12th of October, starboard side or right side to that pier, tied up, getting ready to take on fuel. At about 9:30, we're finally secured. We shut down our 4 main engines, 2 per each of the shafts, 2 rudders for the ship, and got ready to take on fuel. We started the import refueling checklist, and at about 10 o'clock that morning, my main propulsion assistant comes up and says, "Captain, I've got the list done. I've gone through all the checks. I've checked all the valves to make sure they're aligned properly. The chief engineer's doing her checks. If you just skip ahead real quick, if you'll sign it, I'll go back down to the central control station, which is like the engineering nerve center for the ship. And when the engineer's done, she can just sign it and we can get going." And I looked at him and smiled, knew I was dealing with a very talented officer. He'd actually started in the Navy as a young fireman recruit, worked his way up to be a chief petty officer, then made that promotion jump over, became an officer, and he's standing there, and I said, "You know, Drew, I really appreciate this, but the reality of it is, I bottom line every time we do a refueling. So take that back down, wait for the chief engineer. When she's signed off on it, I will then sign it, and we can start refueling the ship." Of course, being a good, experienced, prior enlisted sailor, he expressed his complete satisfaction with my logic. Walked down below and waited for the chief engineer. Unfortunately, that'd be the last time I'd see him alive. At about 10:30, the chief engineer came up, checklist is complete, valve alignment's done. I signed off, and a few minutes later we started refueling the ship. At 10:40, the supply officer came up and said, "Captain, I've got a great deal. We can have 3 boats that can come out to us. They'll remove all of our trash, hazardous materials, and plastics, which we can't dump at sea, and they'll do it for $150. I said, "Wow, that is a great deal." No. Now, as business leaders, you can call me cheap, you can call me frugal, but I looked at it and said, I don't want to give one more thin dime to this port than I absolutely have to. In 4 days, I can get rid of everything for free when we pull into Bahrain, which is the headquarters for 5th Fleet in the region. So I told the supply officer, no, don't want to do it. Besides, when we pull back into Norfolk in February, the deck crew that works outside, this would buy 2 foul weather jackets for them. So I was looking ahead. Like the MPA, she nodded her head in the north-south direction, said, "Flawless logic, Captain." Couldn't agree more. Walked out, came back 10 minutes later with reinforcements in tow. She's got the executive officer with him. She says, "Captain, here's what we need to do." I said, "Fine." I relented, go make it happen. She got a big grin on her face, went out, whistled and gave a thumbs up to the 2 boats that had already come out and were resting alongside the ship, and the crew began dumping in the garbage. She had complete confidence that the XO was going to be able to convince me to do it, which he did. It was at that point, though, that the XO informed me that the refueling rate for the ship, which we expected to be around 300 to 500 gallons per minute, which was going to keep us there for about 6 to 8 hours as we took on about 250,000 gallons of fuel, was much higher than we anticipated. Instead of 300 to 500 gallons per minute, the refueling rate coming on the ship initially was 2,500 gallons per minute. We were actually overpressurizing the fuel tanks and had to have the Yemeni fuel workers tighten on a valve on the pier to bring the refueling rate down to about 2,000 gallons per minute. That would allow us to control it in the big centerline tanks as well as the wing tanks on the ship so that we didn't spill any into the harbor. But what did that do for me? It took that 6 to 8 hours that I was going to be in port refueling and collapsed it down now to about 2 to 2.5 hours max. The executive officer had talked with the supply officer and we'd be able to get the crew fed early. I said, go make the announcement and let's make it happen. So he went down, made that announcement. The crew started queuing up to eat early so we could get the ship underway right after we finished refueling the ship. I was sitting in my cabin at 11:18 that morning when there was a thunderous explosion. You could feel that entire 505 feet and 8,400 tons of destroyer violently thrust up and to the right. We almost seemed to hang in the air for a second before we came back down in the water. We rocked from side to side. We surged forward and backward on the mooring lines holding us to the pier. Fortunately, none of them broke. All the lights went out. 2 emergency lights came on. Ceiling tiles, similar to what you see in here, popped out and landed on the deck. A picture mounted on the wall popped off and landed. A round table with coffee and water on it in my cabin flipped over, spilling everything everywhere. I literally had to grab the underside of my desk and come up on the balls of my feet as I watched everything lift up and slam back down. I immediately got up, turned to my left, and walked to the door in my cabin. There's one light shining there, and there's one light halfway down the hall. And as I'm standing there, I'm watching this cloud come toward me. There's complete silence, and it washes over me. I can smell the dust. I can smell the fuel. But I can smell an acrid tang in the air, but I don't know what it is. Young officer that lived right behind me, he comes out of his stateroom, pauses, looks at me, using good sailor-like language, goes, "What the F was that?" And then he goes, "Fuel." Because like everyone else, we thought we'd had a fuel explosion. He immediately takes off toward the port or left side of the ship to go down to the entrance to main engine room number 1, which is co-located with the refueling lab, where we were controlling the fuel going into the tanks. I took one step out of my cabin to follow him and stopped. To this day, I don't know why, but I knew we'd been attacked. When we had pulled into that port, turned the ship around and moored it starboard side to the pier, if it had been an explosion on the pier, we should have violently been thrust to the left. If it had been an internal explosion, we would have shaken like we experienced, but because we were next to that stationary pier, we still would have probably gone left. I'd been thrust up into the right. The only thing on the left side of the ship was open harbor water, so I knew something had come alongside. I went back in my cabin, opened a safe, got out a 9mm, loaded, chambered around, decocked it, went out, went back outside the ship and stopped halfway out. As I look toward the back end of the ship, I don't see anyone around. The quarterdeck watch that had been there in the middle of the ship, kind of overseeing the refueling operation going on down on the pier, they're gone. The podium, similar to this one, has been blown into pieces and is scattered across the deck. Wires that used to form our high-frequency radio antenna are snapped off and laying on the deck, and there's this dirty black water dripping off of everything. I don't know whether we're going to be boarded. I don't know whether we're going to have another attack, but I know I need to get to the port side and find out what's going on. As I get out there, the first thing I did was walk over to the port side. I lean over the edge, and that's what I see. This hole in the side of the ship. You could clearly see the indentation of the middle, indicating that we had had an external explosion, forcing all that metal inwards. And as I lean over, I also see something else. There are 4 rafts alongside the ship. One sunk right in the blast hole. 2 more lying flat alongside the ship, but one fully inflated back by that flight deck area where we landed those helicopters. First thing that goes through my mind is, how did someone get these rafts alongside the ship? One's clearly detonated. The other 2 have obviously, something's gone wrong, but that one that's fully inflated poses a danger. At the same time, I'm watching all these sailors come out from the ship. And what are they doing? They're curious. They're looking over the side trying to find out what's going on, but they're exposing themselves to that raft that could blow up. So I told the security teams that were now beginning to come out from everywhere to secure the defensive perimeter around the ship again. Get everyone that's not on the team back inside the ship. That decision would have huge ramifications later that I'll get into. So they clear everyone off and push them inside the ship. And that's when a young sailor came up and said, "Captain, it wasn't the rafts. It was a boat that came alongside. The 2 garbage barges left, and what we thought was the 3rd boat that came to the middle of the ship had 2 guys in it. They stood up, they waved, and kaboom, that's what blew up. Those rafts are ours, look." And sure enough, when I looked up on the ship, every one of our life rafts that was in a big gray container had been blown out and landed in the water, and that's what we were seeing alongside the ship. So I instantly knew that wasn't the danger and told them, get them cleared away. I don't want any distractions for the security team. At that point, I knew I needed to engage in what I call crisis management. My timeline shifted from operating in terms of seconds and minutes to now hours ahead, because I knew, even though I hadn't seen wounded, I was operating in that golden hour to try and get them off the ship to a hospital so that we could take care of them and save their lives. But really, when you look at it, what's crisis management? Nothing more than the ability to think in the now, but plan ahead. As leaders, you're the only ones in an organization at times that may have the ability to do that. You take in everything, you react to it, and you move forward. I go inside the ship, pitch dark, I walk up to the bridge and establish communications with the Yemeni port authorities. I asked them for 3 things. First, notify your local hospitals. I've got wounded, I need to get to them. They agreed. 2, freeze all harbor movements. I didn't want any ships entering or leaving the harbor till I knew what was going on. They agreed. Lastly, I said, send boats out to the ship. I couldn't get to my boats because they were on my starboard side next to the pier. They agreed to do that, but I put a condition on them. I said, when you come out to the ship, do not approach my port side any closer than 100 meters. If you do that, I will shoot you. Now, I don't care where you are in the world, when you tell someone something like that, there is no problem with the English language. They clearly understood that. They stayed clear on the other side of the harbor, made this huge arc around the ship, came up to the pier, and we would eventually start getting wounded off the ship. It was at that point that I turned to the operations officer and established the new rules of engagement. 3-step process. Forget that 3/4-inch thick book that they give us. I chucked that and needed to keep it simple at that point. If a boat comes inside that 100-meter arc, warn them once with a bullhorn. If it continues to come, fire 1 warning shot, and if they continue to close, open up with every weapon you have. If it turns out to be the wrong boat, I'll bear responsibility for it, but I can't afford to have another boat come alongside. At that point, I left the operations officer in charge of the bridge team, went down to my cabin, grabbed a flashlight, and went down inside the ship. When I arrived on what we call the damage control deck, which is the one hallway or passageway that runs the length of the ship, and began walking back towards CCS, that central control station, I got my first piece of good news. Because back toward the end of the ship, I saw lights on. I knew that if I had lights on, I had a generator running, which meant I could get power to pumps, which meant I could save the ship. But when I get to the middle of the ship, that's where one of my 3 repair lockers is, where I can combat damage from. It's jammed shut and no one's around. So I'm down 1/3 on my ability to keep that ship afloat. As I turned and looked down the passageway of what used to be the mess line where the crew had been queued up to eat, that's what I was hoping to see. Instead, what do I see? This wall of metal. I don't even think I can walk down it. So instead, I walked a little bit further back in the ship, and there's our medical treatment area. Great. I open the doors, it's in the dark. So now I don't have a medical treatment area for the crew. Instead, what I have are 2 little remote battle dressing stations, one at the forward end and one at the back end of the ship, that can hopefully save my crew that I know are injured. But there's a great design on these ships. The back door of medical opens up onto the mess decks where the crew eats. And a lot of people would say, why the mess decks? Well, when you look at it, those tables are 24 inches wide, 60 to 72 inches long. The perfect length to take a wounded sailor, lift them up, put them on that, and do triage to save their lives. As I walk out onto the mess decks, though, what do I see? It's in the dark. There's shattered glass, shattered plates, knives, forks, spoons, trays, food scattered everywhere. No one is around. So what do? You take all this bad information in, you take a deep breath, and you figure out what you're going to do next. I walked over to the port side of the ship to see what I could see. As I got to the port side, there was the door that led forward up to where the mess line was. It's bent, and what you really can't see in that picture is what used to be the floor of the deck is bent up at a 60-degree angle. The port side is now cut off completely, and I cannot use it for the damage control teams working to save the ship. I come back into the mess decks, and that's when I noticed that I, in fact, can walk through a small hallway up to where that mess line was. So I walk up there, and as I get there, I'm hoping to see the mess decks themselves. That's what I'd hoped it would look like. Instead, what I see is this: complete and utter devastation. But as I turn, I can walk 2 steps to my left, and when I do that, I'm literally standing at the edge of the blast hole itself. You can see down into what's left of number 1 engine room. You can see the sunlight coming in through the side of the ship. The water is quietly lapping in there, and you can smell fuel, and lots of it. We estimated that the Yemenis continued to pump at that 2,000 gallon per minute rate for at least 5 to 7 minutes after the blast. But it's not the smell of the fuel that worries me now. It's down in that hole. You can hear the zzz, zzz, zzz. It's the popping and crackling of all the live electrical wires in all that fuel. And I'm thinking, great. Not only have I suffered a devastating explosion, now I'm going to have a major fire on my hands. I know I've got to get to Central Control Station and find out what's going on. So I walk back out the mess decks, walk through the mess line itself, out, and I'm back in that starboard side passageway when I came face to face with that earlier decision. When the blast had occurred, it had knocked out the announcing system to tell the crew what to do. It had knocked out the alarm system, so we had no idea what was flooding or what may be on fire. The crew had gathered up their wounded shipmates, and what had they done? They had left the area of all that carnage and devastation in the galley area and in the mess decks area and headed outside of the ship. What had I done? I didn't know what the topside security situation was, and I shoved them in the ship. So guess what became my triage area? That hallway right there. And there they were, stacked up all the way down. Wounds were typical for what you'd see in a blast like this. Broken bones, shrapnel, cuts, scrapes, bruises. As commanding officer, I would have given an eye tooth to talk to every one of my wounded sailors. But they are not my number 1 priority. My number 1 priority has to be the ship. So I step amongst the wounded, rounded the corner, and walked up into the Central Control Station. To my left is the chief engineer working with our engineers to determine the status of the generator. What's the pump load? How many kilowatts have we got running on the generator? To my right is the executive officer working with the damage control assistant, figuring out where has the damage occurred, what's flooded, how are we getting systems isolated so we can contain the damage to as small an area as possible. At that point, I made what I consider to be the smartest decision of my command tour. I kept my mouth shut. The last thing I needed to do was walk into a situation that I had no idea what was going on and try and take charge. So instead, I just stood there for 45 seconds to a minute, watched the ebb and flow of communications coming in and out of CCS and between the 2 groups, and then I said, Chief Engineer, XO, when you have a minute, tell me what we've got. It was at that point that they briefed me There are 4 main engineering spaces on the ship. Auxiliary machinery room number 1 forward, that has our number 1 generator. Behind that, main engine room number 1, that has 1 Alpha 1 Bravo gas turbine engines and the shaft for the starboard side of the ship that runs the length of the ship. Just behind that is auxiliary machinery room number 2, which has pumps, air conditioning units, and the shaft going through it. Above that is our supply support, which contains all the spare parts for the ship. And above that is our reefer decks, which contains refrigerator, freezer, and all our dry provisions with about 60 days worth of food on the ship. And just behind that, my largest engineering space is main engine room number 2, which has 2 Alpha 2 Bravo gas turbine engines for the port shaft as well as my number 2 generator. She briefed me main engine room number 1 is flooded completely. Just behind it we had what's called progressive flooding. Flooding had gone from auxiliary machinery room number 2 up into supply support, up into the reefer decks. We had leaking forward both into auxiliary machine room number 1 and back aft into main engine room number 2. The chief engineer asked me point blank, are we going to lose the ship? Thank goodness I had paid attention in school as I was building and living and working on these ships over the years. So I looked at her and said, no, we're not going to lose the ship. If all we've lost are these 2 main sets of spaces, we're going to save the ship. Knowing that one key piece of information proved critical, not for the technical knowledge that it contained, but because everyone suddenly realized that we were no longer on the backside of the power curve wondering if we could save the ship. They knew that we probably could. Everybody just calmed down and the tension level went down by an order of magnitude. They refocused their efforts and we went right back to saving the ship. I stayed down there for a few more minutes until we got the water main pressure restored so that we could fight a fire if we had to because the pipe had been damaged. And what did we do at that point? I left to go do the triage effort. I walk to the midships area of the ship. When I get there, I get briefed by my chief corpsman, who is like a physician's assistant for the ship. He tells me the status of the wounded. I've got 1, 2, 3 already strapped into metal litters, ready to be evacuated off the ship. As I look at the number 3 guy, he's my senior chief gas turbine technician. He calls me over. I go over and bend down and he grabs my hand and says, Captain, I don't think I'm going to make it. I looked at him and said, Senior Chief, I don't want to hear that. I want you to think of your wife Lisa and those 2 little blonde-haired kids that want to see their daddy again. You're going to be fine. He goes, but Captain, I don't think you know how seriously I'm injured. Well, in fact, I had gotten a brief from the chief corpsman on exactly the status of his injury. He had been the last chief petty officer evacuated out of the chief's mess, which was just forward of the galley, which you saw was completely destroyed by the blast. He had literally been thrown across the room, had landed on the deck, and was buried in debris. When they finally got to him, he was waving a little flashlight and was telling them, don't worry about me, I'm fine. But I've got a guy laying on top of me that hasn't moved since the blast occurred. I just can't get out from underneath the debris. Get that stuff off and get him taken care of, I'll be fine. So they lifted off all the debris. When they got down to him, it wasn't someone lying on top of him. It was his right leg lying up and across his left shoulder with a compound fracture to the femur. Those are the kind of life-threatening injuries that we were now dealing with. So what did they do? Hey, Senior, this is probably going to hurt a little bit. So they flopped his leg out straight. He didn't feel a thing. They got him strapped into a litter, brought him up. That's when it began to hurt. They gave him a little bit of morphine and we got him ready to go off. But I just gripped his hand and he said, you don't know how badly I'm hurt? I said, Senior Chief, all you got's a badly busted leg. You're not even the number 1 priority to go off the ship. So you keep thinking of those 2 kids that want to see you again. You're going to be fine. We'll get you out of here in a minute. Now when I had pulled into that port, I had made a decision not to put a gangway or a prow down to the pier. It was just an additional force protection measure. Ah yes, once again, those decisions you make early on that come back to haunt you. Now how do I get wounded off the ship? We would end up taking them, dragging them over to the edge of the ship. There was a wooden ladder down on the pier. We extended it out from about 12 to 20 feet, the kind that you use at your house to go clean the rain gutters and get on the roof. We leaned it up against the ship at a 45-degree angle. We tied lines to the feet, lines to the head, tipped that litter over the side, and slid it down the ladder till the Yemeni fuel workers could grab it and run the wounded sailor over to a boat to be evacuated off the ship. At the 30-minute point, my navigator comes up to me and says, Captain, we're starting to get the wounded off the ship, but we don't know where they're going, what their condition is. We don't know what their treatment regimen is. I recommend we send someone ashore to coordinate the activities there and find out what's going on. Great idea, Nav. Who do you recommend? Sir, I'll volunteer to go. As soon as the brow is over, you make it happen. I'm going to jump ahead in the story here. At the 1 hour point, the Brow goes down to the pier, she goes down, goes to the hospitals, coordinates where all the sailors are, even gets word back to the ship to send 25 blood donors ashore, which we do, and then come back to the ship. She stays there. Say what you want about the politics of a few years ago, but who was the first country to really come to our aid? The French. They would fly a medical evacuation aircraft into Aden that night. They would take 11 of my most seriously wounded sailors with a team of doctors and fly them to Djibouti, and my navigator would go with them. The next day, the Air Force flew two aircraft into the region, one into Aden and one into Djibouti, and took all my wounded sailors out. My navigator could have left on that flight, and I never would have questioned her motives. But I will tell you, get online and Google a little short story called Message to Garcia. It's about a 10-minute read at most, but it's called Message to Garcia. And you'll understand why. I would have never doubted that my navigator was looking after my crew if she had left with those aircraft. Instead, once they were gone, she coordinated with the embassy, got on a flight, flew from Djibouti back to Aden, made her way from the airport to a hotel downtown where she checked in with the admiral who was overseeing the Joint Task Force responding to the attack. Then she made her way from there down to the piers, got on a boat, came out to the ship, crossed the pier, walked up the Brow, and reported back aboard for duty. That's the level of dedication I had of my officers on board the ship that day. The 1 hour point. I'm standing there in the defense attaché. An Army Lieutenant Colonel is standing on the pier and he says, "Captain, have you had a chance to communicate what's happened to you to 5th Fleet up in Bahrain?" Said, "We have no power. We have no communications forward. I have not communicated." He says, "Well, I've got a cell phone here. It's GSM capable. I've got the number to the ops center. Do you want to call?" I said, "Toss it up." So he leans back and wings this phone up to me. And as I'm watching it tumble through the air, I'm thinking to myself, you know, when you were in high school and at the Naval Academy, you played 2 sports, golf and tennis. Neither involved catch. And I knew that at that point, if there's one time you better catch, this is going to be it. Well, I watch this phone, I cup it, catch it, I flip it open, I dial the number, ring, ring, 5th Fleet Command Center, duty officer speaking, may I help you? I said, "Yes, this is Commander Kirk Lippold, Commanding Officer USS Cole. I have an OPREP 3 Pinnacle front burner report." Now I'll translate that for you. OPREP 3, that's an operational report anytime a ship, an aircraft, or a submarine has a major incident aboard it. Pinnacle, that means it's going to be of national level interest. Not just Navy, national. Big media is going to be involved. Front burner, that's an attack on U.S. forces. So when I tell that duty officer I've got an OPREP 3 Pinnacle front burner report, the first thing I get is silence, and then I get that duty officer asking me, "Are you sure?" Yes, I'm sure. All I've had to do is look over the port side of the ship and see that hole, and I know what's happened. At that point, I know his hand's shaking as he begins to make that first report. And it would take about 20 minutes before the world would know that USS Cole had been attacked by a terrorist. It would take us 99 minutes to evacuate 33 wounded sailors off that ship. A little bit more than that golden hour, but as a testament to the crew, of those 33, 32 would survive. We would later learn that 17 sailors had been killed in the attack. A total of 37 were wounded. 5 additional ones would be evacuated in the following days, mostly due to ruptured eardrums that we detected not immediately, but in the ensuing couple of days. We would begin systems restoration immediately, and it would go on for the next few days. On Saturday, things seemed to be going well. People were beginning to come into town. All sorts of folks were arriving on board the ship. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Navy Criminal Investigative Service, Mobile Diving Salvage Unit 2. They were going to help us get our sailors out of the wreckage as well as start the criminal investigation into what had happened. Saturday night, however, we're sitting there and facing some unique challenges. The couple of days before had been unique for us. Here we had been sitting alongside the pier, and you can see the orange raft up there. That's one of the rafts that was alongside the ship that had actually flipped up and hung onto the ship itself. At the time and during the previous couple days, we were the most modern 21st century destroyer afloat. And how did we prevent the ship from flooding? Well, back in number 2 engine room where the shaft came through, we used modern 21st century technology to stop water from flooding in, pounding in wedges and this waxy rope called oakum. I like that technology. It worked great and has done the same thing since World War II. How did we sleep? There's no power in the ship, there's no air conditioning. So we have to sleep on the topside deck. Everyone is out under the stars, so that's how the crew slept. There we were the first morning after the blast. Somebody took a picture. Pretty challenging conditions for us, but I knew we'd be able to persevere through it. So that wasn't going to be a problem. So here we are alongside the pier when on Saturday night, we began to have a space that we had mostly gotten the water out of. That auxiliary machinery room number 2 began to reflood, and we didn't know why. At about 1:30 in the morning, those hairs that a commanding officer gets were standing up on the back of my neck, and I said, wake the crew up, put everyone back at general quarters. I don't know what's going on, but I'm very concerned about the status of the ship. And thank goodness I did that. 15 minutes later, our only operating generator, number 3, stopped because of fuel starvation. Not a problem. I have 3 chances to restart it with high pressure air, but over the next 4 hours, we would go 1, 2, 3, and the generator wouldn't restart. We're now what we call hot, dark, and quiet. 5th Fleet, however, had foreseen this might happen and had brought a 250 kilowatt generator out to the pier. So we go down to start that generator to get power to the ship. When things can go from bad to worse, they will. The generator doesn't start. So now I have no way to start the ship. I'm flooding. More importantly, I'm beginning to flood the rest of the ship. And there's no way I can pump it off. The portable pumps we had weren't strong enough to get it out. That's when the executive officer and engineer came up with an idea. Captain, if we go down lower in the ship, cut 2 holes in the side of the ship, we can start one of those pumps and we can help stop that flooding water. I said, make it happen. Just make sure you don't measure once or twice or 3 times. Measure as many times as you need, because once you start those cuts, and with the list of the ship, if we start cutting too low and you bring water in, we're in trouble. So make those cuts a little higher than you think they probably need to be. They would make those cuts after about 4 hours, and we'd be able to get the pumps going and just hold the water level steady. It was at that point that one of my sailors came up to me and said, Captain, I got a great idea. We've got these Scott air packs, same as you see with the fire departments. Instead of recharging those Scott air packs though, what if we took those charging units, put them on the flight deck, jury-rigged them together, and instead of charging a small air flask, we charged the large air flask, about 24 inches wide and 8 foot high, and recharged it for the generator. Said, make it happen. Giving the ability of your people by trusting and invest them to allow them to think outside the box proved its weight in gold. 10.5 hours later, at 5 minutes after midnight, we had 2 shots of high pressure air, and on the first one, number 3 generator restarted, and we had power the entire time we were in port. That's kind of the investment that we had at that point. You can see the danger. If we had continued to flood forward into auxiliary machinery room number 2 or number 1 and back into main engine room number 2, we probably would have sunk right next to the pier. Unfortunately, we did not. So we continued alongside the pier for a period of about 2.5 weeks till it came time for us to get ready to go out on Blue Marlin. But as I stop and I reflect back, I look at how we came to be there. A lot of people wonder, why were we in that position? When you look, Al-Qaeda had spent almost 2 years casing Navy ships. They could observe where we were next to that pier. This is a picture taken from the safe house where they observed how ships operated in that port. We never detected an earlier attack in January of 2000. And when we pulled in, just like 9/11, they didn't target coal, but they did target a Navy ship. When they were ready, they went. We just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time and paid a very, very tragic price. But on the 29th of October, we knew we were going to go on this heavy lift ship called Blue Marlin. We got lifted off the pier by 4 tugs. I had mandated complete silence on the ship because I wanted the crew to be able to hear how the ship was performing. We were back and manning our repair lockers and general quarter station as we came off. The ship held rock solid. Well built. We sustained it. We weren't going to have problems. We start getting towed out of the pier. As we get headed out of port, just off the picture to the right, there's a pier that have 2 Yemeni Navy patrol boats. The crews from those boats had come out, manned the pier, and as we went by, they came to attention in their full dress uniforms and rendered honors to us. And as professional sailors, we would render honors back to them. But as we're going out of port, I had turned to the XO and said, play the number 1 song. What did we play? the national anthem. You bet. I wanted that song to be echoing across that harbor so that those people in that port would know that we were leaving with our heads held high. Once we had finished rendering honors, though, and we got to the other side, I turned to the XO and said, play the second song. What did we play again? National anthem. Second time, however, was by Jimi Hendrix. Then I turned to the XO and said, XO, the crew's earned it, let them play what they want. In an instant, I would learn a valuable lesson as commanding officer as to just how much leash you should give your sailors. Because the noise that I hear coming out of the speakers is absolutely god-awful. And I turned to the XO, and for the first time in 2.5 weeks, I get to exercise command prerogative and use sailor-like language myself. What the is that? Get that off there now. That is not music. The XO takes off like a jackrabbit out of the bridge, goes back aft toward the flight deck to turn it off. I'm convinced all he did was round the corner and wait. Came back a few minutes later and said, Captain, I was trying to go down, but the ladders are damaged. I was, safety's number one. I wanted to make sure that everything was okay before I got back there. Right, XO, thanks. What did the crew play? Kid Rock, American Badass. Say what you want about Kid Rock, great American. When he learned that we played his song, he would play a benefit concert for the crew 7 months later, where he would raise over $75,000 for the USS Cole Memorial. So, say what you want about his tattoos and his lifestyle, I don't care. He's a great American and I own that CD. But I will admit up front, I have not uploaded it into my iPod just yet. Even I have my limitations. So what do? We get towed down the pier, or towed down the coast about 23 miles. We get positioned over the top of Blue Marlin. Once we're all set, everybody backs off, and they raise us up. The reason we were cocked off to the side is at the forward part of the ship, we have that sonar dome, which is actually the lowest part, and we had to keep that off the ship. So we're sitting very low, we go up on Blue Marlin. But as water is actually draining off the deck, they used one of the little yellow cranes, swung me out, dropped me down, and I walked up and walked out to the port side of the ship. And as I walked and stood below the hull, I was in complete and utter awe at what my crew had accomplished. While you saw that little picture earlier, this picture right here shows the size of the hull. And you can see a 6-foot man down there in a white t-shirt pushing a broom. Just to give you some idea, 40 by 40 foot, it was like a giant had just come to the ship and just punched a hole in it. Damage extended almost all the way across the ship. And it was at our widest point about 66 feet. So I look back on that and everything that we did, and what does it really come down to? It comes down to those principles that we put in place at the very beginning. All those things with leadership, all those things that you can do to make your teams a success are there. When you think about crisis management, don't ever underestimate your ability as the most experienced company around to be able to think forward while everyone else is dealing with the immediate problems. And what it really brings me back is to the very first day. Every day a ship is in port, they hold a ceremony called Colors, where at 8 o'clock in the morning we raise our national anthem with the national anthem, and every evening at sunset, calculated no matter where we are in the world, we lower our flag. Well, at the end of that very first day, things have pretty much quieted down, the wounded are off, the ship is stable, it's coming up on sunset. The executive officer turns and looks at me and says, Captain, what do you want to do about colors tonight? We're standing back near that flight deck area in the flag, and I remember looking at him, thinking, geez, should we lower it because we don't want to disrupt the routine? Do we want to lower it to half-mast to honor those that have been killed and wounded in the attack? But I knew in my heart what I was going to do. And the reality of it was, I turned to the XO and said, we're not going to lower that flag. I want that flag to fly at full mast as a symbol of our resolve that we're not going to allow this terrorist attack to deter us from our mission of defending freedom. I want that flag to fly at full mast under lights until every one of our shipmates is recovered out of the wreckage and begins that long journey home to their families. It would take us 8 days to recover all of our sailors out of that wreckage. That flag would fly every night under lights. Sailors could wake up in the middle of the night, turn and look toward the back of the ship, and they would see that flag flying. And every morning when we woke up, sleeping on the outside of the ship as we did in those first few days, there was that flag flying, and you can see the stains on it from the explosive residue. On the 9th day, we held a memorial ceremony after everyone had been recovered and began that journey home. We had cots lined up on the flight deck, and as we took that flag right at sunset, we slowly lowered it after we held a ceremony where the chaplain had given the invocation. I had spoke, and one sailor from every one of the ranks we had lost gave a short speech. An officer, a chief petty officer, and enlisted. And we finished lowering that flag, we folded it, and we had 17 sailors lined up on the starboard side of the ship. As we took that flag and passed it from sailor to sailor, we paused, rang the ship's bell twice, announced the name of the shipmate that we'd lost. And when it got to the end, my command master chief took that flag, presented it to me, and I turned it over to my relief, and it is now mounted on the mess decks of that ship. It served as a source of inspiration during our darkest days there, and it serves as a source of inspiration for those sailors serving aboard USS Cole today. And I will tell you right now, I'm keeping an eye on it, because the ship will eventually finish serving our nation. And that flag is going to go to a museum. It's part of our national history. It's part of my naval heritage, our naval heritage, and I want to make sure that it's appropriately displayed for others to remember in the future. And it has been an absolute honor to share the story of my heroes with you this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.